Thank you very much for coming. I want to welcome you here at the Institute, International Institute for Peace. I'm very much surprised that so many came because we were a bit hesitant if in the beginning of January and in English we could do some discussion, but I'm very pleased that you came. Just met also someone in the underground who was at the election observer in Georgia, so it's a good coincidence. Yes, I want to welcome two of our speakers. Unfortunately, the third one, Mr. Dubovi, got sick this morning, got fever, and he couldn't come. So we have to apologize him. But I want to welcome LEILA ALIEVA. There's a very long list you have on the CV, so I think if I would read everything, that it would be the end of the debate. We met some years ago. Yeah. For me, it's many years. For you, it's only some few years ago. I think it was in Baku, and we were very happy to see each other at a conference organized by the Austrian presidency here in Vienna. LEILA is from Azerbaijan. She is, for the moment, in Vienna at the CARA and doing great work there, but in principle she's now in St. Antony College in Oxford. And ALEXANDRA DIENES, she is with us in Vienna also now, for a longer time in Vienna. At the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, one of those from the regional office of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and there's a lot of work in relation with the neighborhood of the European Union, neighborhood also of Russia, opinion polls, and there's a very, very important work also with the younger generation from these countries to get them involved into democratic procedures and processes and so on. So both speakers know the region very well, and I think it's very good we have both speakers here. Now I think looking at the region of the South Caucasus, for the moment it's a bit in the shadow of other conflicts, especially the conflict in Ukraine, and on the other hand, there's the conflict, of course, in the wider Middle East, including, of course, the whole situation in Iran, conflict with the US, and when we read in the papers or the media today, we heard that the US Army or the Ministry of Defense have been asked to prepare possibilities of an attack on Iran. This may, of course, inflame also the whole region. But for the moment, it's relatively quiet. New developments, positive developments have been seen, for example, in Armenia, with some changes in the government brought about by demonstrations and the people in general. It's not always that these changes bring stability, but for the moment it seems, at least, but this would be also the question. Azerbaijan is stability. If it's so positive is another issue, because sometimes instability is the positive thing, sometimes stability is the positive or the negative thing. And of course, we have still in Georgia the situation that two parts, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, are occupied and are not government controlled. And there's the problem of Nagorny Karabakh, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And the big elephant in the room of most of these countries is, of course, Russia. Maybe for the moment Russia has other things to do, especially in Syria, maybe also in relation to Ukraine, to watch the situation there. But so, seen from the outside, for the moment, things go relatively well. But my question to you, the two speakers, is that some guarantee or does it create some hope that things can move forward. You know, Armenia, for example, has good relation with Russia, good relation also with the neighbor Iran, but also with the European Union. The agreement could be found similar to economic and trade deep free agreement, so that maybe we have a positive development there. Also seeing as an example, and this will be also the question, is it an example where the cooperation between European Union and Russia in the form of Eurasia could develop out also of this example of Armenia, which is a member of Eurasian community, but still has this close relationship, economic relationship with the European Union. And that, of course, is the question then for the other countries as well. So here are still some places, colleague also there, so we still have it. So these are some of the questions I just want to mention, but it's now up, of course, to the speakers to present their ideas or their estimation, their evaluation of the situation as it is. And LEILA, maybe coming from the region, not always voluntarily leaving it, maybe you can say some words.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, first of all, because it's the first time I'm here in this institute, and I'm really grateful to Mr. Swoboda for inviting me here. And in general, to be in German-speaking world is very enlightening and interesting after so many years being in the other part. I really enjoyed my time here, and I definitely enriched my views, my expertise. My only regret is that I didn't learn German because of my very intense traveling schedule. But I promise I will. So anyway, it's very useful to look at what's happening in the region in the historical perspective, particularly in the 90s, where the most passion in the region was to become independent from the northern neighbor. That was a key drivers of the foreign policy of Azerbaijan, Georgia. Armenia had its own agenda due to the Karabakh issue. But Georgia and Azerbaijan were very passionate about getting independent. The focus and strategic importance of the region, which was much higher as compared to what's happening now. And there are a few reasons for that. First of all, of course, the international environment has changed, and also the major assets which were attracting the international attention are diminishing. The major oil projects are being built. The contract of the century, which was the top on agenda of the Western states that in the 90s was signed. Then the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan was also laid as a pipeline, major pipeline. So basically the status quo which exists now doesn't prevent, and including the frozenness of conflict, doesn't prevent the Western interests from its satisfaction. So the oil income continues to flow, or at least the peak of production has already passed, and Azerbaijan is now entering the post-oil era. But what it means that the attention to the region has declined. However, unexpected things are still happening, and one of them is probably the one which very few expected, was the Velvet Revolution in Armenia last year. Why is it so important? First of all, because of very low probability. As you know, there is an approach that there is a competition for soft power influence in the region, and all the non-democratic and authoritarian influence comes from Russia, while the West brings mainly liberalizing and democratizing influences. From Azerbaijani perspective, it's not exactly true, because being from the oil-rich country means that you understand that it's not so much Russia, but also the West, who might support the authoritarian status quo, on the one hand. On the other hand, there is such a thing as the Russian influence, which can be apparently overcome, and that was the case with the Armenian Revolution. At least it gave the basis for Lukan way, Lukan way, as it is called now, to say that in spite of Russia's strong influence in the region, you still can make a breakthrough in the democratization in your country. Domestically, you can do it. And he lists the reasons why it is possible. Well, first of all, of course, it's based on Russia's assessment or calculation of high-cost involvement in the events if they are based on popular legitimacy, and they, like in case of the revolution with Nikol Pashinyan. On the other hand, the previous failure of direct support for the pro-Russian leaders, which they tried to do, whether it was in Ukraine, whether it was immediate or it was postponed, and things like that. So this is one of the approaches. The question is still why it was possible in the case of Armenia, which is tremendously dependent on Russia. It is tremendously dependent on Russia, both in economic sphere, especially in two major sectors of economy are controlled by Russia. Political, and because of the control over Karabakh clans who were in power for so long, and military. So we will come to that military element later, which I consider the key to understanding of what's going on. But the question is, how come that they manage to do it? My view, I'm deeply convinced that it's not just the failure of the incumbents which led to the popular revolt, but it's also the influence of soft power influence of the West, or the role of the links, which is, as you know, is used actively in the theory of links and leverages by the same Lukan way. And the links and investments in soft power, long-term investments in the soft power. I would argue that if you look at the 1990s, you will notice that Armenia was the second after Israel recipient of the US aid. Similarly, if you look at how much EU invested in civil society, you will see that it's disproportionately much as compared to Azerbaijan, for instance. Azerbaijan was deprived of any aid since the early 90s, exactly when there was a peak of the social and political activities and when they needed donors so much. And these long-term investments eventually created the infrastructure in terms of institutional development, civil society, and of course coupled with the new generation, the links and the soft power influence has its effect on the outcome of the events in Armenia. Of course, it's easier to make these changes in the country with small economy, because if you compare it to Azerbaijan and the multi-billion oil revenues which were coming into the country for so long, and they established certain economic groups, which is extremely difficult, and monopoly on economy, which probably uncomparable to what has been developing in Armenia. But again, as I said, probably the other and the second very important issue, why Russia did not intervene. I already partly answered to that question from the point of view of some researchers, but I also think that Russia underestimated the role of attractiveness, of soft power and attractiveness of the Western model. Russia is so much focused in conspiratorial realpolitik view on the international relations, which thinks only in terms of manipulation and manipulative approach in politics, including the soft power, that I think it appeared to be totally non-prepared to the fact that the younger generation is much more free from its nostalgic feelings of the Soviet Union, who is much more independent in their judgments. Of course, there is a factor of diaspora, Armenian diaspora, who played a very important role in realization of this links component. But definitely Russia underestimated that element. Plus, of course, as Mr. Swoboda just mentioned, was distracted to the other conflicts, being absolutely sure that while there is an unresolved conflict in Karabakh, none will make a breakthrough in domestic politics, because these two things are very closely related. My next and probably last, because I'm my next thesis is that, and that was what I told you, I will come to the security issues, that the conflict and domestic conditions are very closely related. They're so tight because they create a status quo, including the absence of trade relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Turkey. So this is part of the status quo. It creates certain groups, economic groups, usually within substantial informal capital. And so this Karabakh clan, which was running the country for 2 decades, was inseparably connected to the support of the traditional perception of threats. And unresolved conflict feeds into the domestic status quo, and the vice versa. So there are two reinforcing elements. I would argue that the achievements of the revolution will not be possible without revision of the approach to the Karabakh issue. Exactly because if the the major security issue, which was the basis for the current status quo, both economic and political in both countries, if this is not resolved, it will be very difficult to consolidate the achievements of the revolution. First, unresolved conflict will continue to give Russia a strong leverage over both countries. Second, there will be a non-stop arms race. Moreover, this arms race will not involve only Russia, but we already see Azerbaijan diversifying its arms trade partners. You know, Israel is very actively cooperating on the weapons sale with Azerbaijan. You will also have Bolton, who came recently and suggested Armenia that they will replace Russia if they want in selling the arms. So there might not be a serious breakthrough, in fact, if the issue is not resolved. However, there are a few approaches to how this issue can be resolved. One of them is to increase involvement of the West to make it more active in resolution, such as EU, US, or other international organizations, to make them more proactive. The other one is to distribute sort of areas of influence between Russia and the West, meaning that Russia, so far as Armenia is officially trying to do, meaning that Russia, convincing Russia that it will never quit the CSTO or any of the defense and security agreements with Russia. So Russia will have it function in the region to provide for security of Armenia, or provide what they call the stability, which means basically the status quo. And the third suggestion is basically, that's what I promote in my paper. It's to reinforce and to encourage the sense of independency as a subject of international relations by the countries themselves in the region, trying to find a solution without relying too much on the external actors. That might change tremendously the security architecture, the status quo, and may lead to some serious changes in the region. And first of all, it should start with the deconstruction of the traditional threats, and the second, to try to bring some normative certainty in the region. Let me stop here. That was 20 minutes, if you don't mind. Maybe we'll...
Okay. We have already a lot of points of discussion. Please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Hanna Swoboda and Stephanie Fenke at International Institute for Peace for inviting me. And I'm really excited to see so many people interested in the Caucasus. I wonder if it's, I don't know, you read a lot about it, or maybe some of you even traveled the region. Anyway, we seem to share the passion, because I'm also very interested in the Caucasus, and was it actually as long as I can remember myself, because I was born and raised in Russia, and the Caucasus, having been once part of the old empire, which thank God broke apart in 1991, but it was always a kind of, some magic place for me, or place where fairy tales take place, or something exotic, I should say, probably. So during my studies, I was thinking of going to the Caucasus or having some chance to maybe work there. But then the war broke out, 2008, you probably remember, between Russia and Georgia. And the region didn't seem to become quieter than it was after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Anyway, I got my chance. I went to Georgia and worked there for a little bit when I was a graduate student. And now in my work here at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, indeed, we look a lot at this region. Because if you look at the broader picture of, say, Russia-West confrontation that we seem to face, particularly acute since 2008, the Georgian crisis, and obviously since 2014, when the crisis in and around Ukraine broke out. Anyway, this region still seems to attract a lot of attention and be kind of the focal point of many of those tensions that Russia and the West now face. And there seems to be kind of a dividing line going through this region without us maybe perhaps even noticing, simply by looking into the countries and seeing how different they orient themselves towards Russia or the West. So if we look at Armenia, as LEILA was already laying out, it's clearly very strongly oriented towards Russia, being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a kind of an modeled upon the EU, but only in theory, an integration project, economic integration project that Russia drives in the post-Soviet space. And Armenia kind of didn't have a choice but to join, even though they wanted to sign an association agreement with the EU. But having seen the events in Ukraine, it was actually even prior to that, anyway, back then the Armenian authorities reconsidered because of the security concerns, because we know that Russia is the most important military partner and security partner. So Armenia is also a member of the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is, a dinosaur in a way, which survived the Cold War. That is the Russia-centered military bloc in the post-Soviet space. And then we have Georgia, which has a completely different outlook, being having an association agreement with the EU, wanting to join NATO, so in security policy, but also economic policy, a totally different outlook. And then we have Azerbaijan, which is a member to none of those organizations that I mentioned, and which so far, thanks to oil revenues, seems to can afford to have a pretty independent foreign and economic policy. Another reason why the region is very contentious, or should indeed capture our attention, are of course the frozen conflicts we were already mentioning. And today I want to share with you just some thoughts on how Georgia is managing its frozen conflicts. So here I mean Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We'll speak about that in a second. And of course all the recent political change. I mean, what happened in Armenia. I traveled there last time, February 2018. So basically it was just 2 months, so say a few weeks before the revolution broke out. I took part in a conference there. We discussed pros and cons of Armenia being in the Eurasian Economic Union and how it can position itself between Russia and the EU. And everybody was complaining about the government, starting from the taxi driver up to those experts sitting in the conference. But I must tell you, there was not this feeling of revolution is in the air. So what happened just a few weeks later was, at least to me and to many experts in Armenia to whom I spoke afterwards, a total surprise. So for those of you who are interested in social sciences or perhaps have studied or studies social political science, this is yet another example where we see that political change can come very unexpectedly. If we look back at the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think many were caught by surprise. The financial crisis appeared to have caught many by surprise, and the Armenian Revolution was another example that I think can also be put on this list of major political upheavals and events that not only Putin's administration might have underestimated or miscalculated. I think it's a great achievement in terms of a peaceful transition of power, and now we have seen that it institutionalized itself, so the new government by Pashinyan has now a really huge majority in the parliament of over 70% of seats. And actually, critically, one could ask now, so how does it gonna develop? So Pashinyan seems to be a very progressive, liberally minded, open politician, at the same time having been kind of the lead of a grassroots movement. Now he is at the top of a government with full control of the Armenian politics. So I'm wondering a little bit who will be the force in the Armenian society controlling this government and maybe exercising necessary political or societal kind of oversight, or who is in the opposition, in other words. Because both parties who managed to enter the parliament with just, I think, between 6 or 7% of the votes cannot be seriously considered an opposition. And the previous ruling party, as you know, didn't even manage to get into the parliament. They didn't pass the threshold. So it's a complete kind of turnover. Georgia, on the other hand, they just elected a new president. It is somewhat more of a ceremonial function, or not the most important function in the government. There I don't expect much of a change with Salome Zurabishvili. On the other hand, the society, and this is just my personal impression from having been to Georgia several times, is a very vibrant one. I mean, Armenia has also proven to have a very vibrant society, but Georgia has a longer track record of mobilizing in a grassroots manner, of protesting their government. I mean, you know, there was a Rose Revolution in 2003, which swept away the old regime. And there is a kind of a growing feeling that some dissatisfaction may be gaining some momentum now, so dissatisfaction with the Georgian Dream government. I'll be maybe jumping a little bit from one topic to another, but just maybe a word on NATO in terms of Georgia. Even a decade ago, when I first went to Georgia, there was this huge sign in the middle of the main street, I think not far away from the parliament: integration with NATO is our main foreign policy priority. And in fact, it hasn't changed. And to me, it's interesting to see how this priority is still being reiterated. And by the way, NATO supports it, which is, well, that's perhaps my personal impression, but a bit crazy or idiosyncratic. There was a NATO summit just this summer where the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, really, it's a quote, Georgia will become a member of NATO. So it's this reiteration of the commitment that they got already, I think it was 2008 at the Bucharest summit. So there seems to be, on this elite level, kind of a consensus that Georgia wants and will be a member of NATO at a certain point. At the same time, from my impression of speaking to experts and at conferences in Georgia, there is some pragmatism gaining influence. Let me put it this way, that it's a very distant goal, and that relations with Russia will still be a powerful, well, that Russia is still a veto player in a way, in practical terms. And in fact, much of what we have been witnessing in terms of policy coming from Georgia has been very pragmatic. So if we take relations with Russia, which, as you can imagine, have been very bad after the 2008 war, there are still no diplomatic relations, in fact. But starting already 2012, so just 4 years after the war, an informal diplomatic format started between two envoys, Karasin on the Russian side and Abashidze on the Georgian side. So those two diplomats started meeting and started discussing economic issues, tourism, visa issues. And year after year, relations actually, in fact, on the ground got better. And I noticed myself how much tourism surged. I mean, there were also official figures that it did, but if you compare being on a street in Tbilisi now and 10 years ago, now you speak or hear a lot of Russian. And you can imagine that Georgians are not very fond of, or haven't been very fond of speaking Russian after the conflict. But now you hear it everywhere, and every menu in the restaurant is in Russian. And just 10 years ago, when I first came to Georgia, I was like really hesitant asking people something in Russian because I thought they would be very angry. So things really changed. And now Russia is, I think, the third trading partner of Georgia after the EU and Turkey. And there's certain products like, for example, iconic Georgian wines. You've probably never heard of Georgian wines because they're not very popular in Europe. Or at least I bet that they're very good, but people in Russia are very fond of those wines, thinking of, Soviet times and this Georgian Kinsmarauli or take any other brand were very, very popular. It's just a little example to show how it makes a lot of sense in economic terms to diversify trade relations. And even though Georgia did make a big, so to speak, pivot to the EU in terms of trade policy and also taking over some of the acquis in the course of having an association agreement and a DCFTA, deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, but it still trades with Russia, and some of the goods are widely popular in Russia, and the market is just much, much bigger. The same kind of normalization regards Georgia's relations with its breakaway republics, like I was mentioning previously. And it's also a very interesting, maybe not a radical, but step-by-step change of approach. For a long time, and actually it still is, it's a policy of non-recognition, obviously, so Abkhazia and South Ossetia are not recognized as independent governments. I think it's only Russia and Nicaragua who were in the United Nations who recognize them. But how to get them back, how to reintegrate the republics back into Georgia, this has been a big policy question for many Georgian politicians. And a more confrontational approach that was used in the past seems to give way to a much more pragmatic and engaging approach today. So this policy of re-engagement targets kind of the hearts and minds of the people. So South Ossetians, and especially the Abkhazians, because you need to imagine that many more people live in Abkhazia than in South Ossetia, they can come to Georgia for medical assistance or for documents, other services, and in fact many people do. So this policy of re-engagement through trade and through humanitarian issues has been a new Georgian approach, and from what I can judge, it is successful, or in the long run it can actually lead to at least peaceful coexistence, or perhaps even really reintegration back into the country. And here Russia comes in, because Russia is obviously an actor interested in keeping those republics the way they are. But so far, Russia doesn't seem to have opposed this re-engagement policy of Georgia, and here's why I think why. So, in a way, Russia doesn't lose anything from Georgia kind of paying for part of the burden of keeping those republics or their citizens alive. And it's a kind of a pragmatic approach perhaps, that both the Georgian actors but also we as European partners can support, even though we have different positions. safe on the status of those republics, even though we can never come to an agreement how the future will look like, but we choose to cooperate on a pragmatic basis just in terms of the day-to-day management of life. So this seems to be the new Georgian approach, and perhaps a very, very small island of cooperation, how we sometimes call it, where Russia, Georgia, and perhaps the European partners also could chip in. Perhaps one more point, but because I'm also interested in your questions, and we can just delve into some topics depending on your interest. Maybe what LEILA mentioned about the independence as a strategy that she suggests for the countries without reliance on external partners, if I understood you correctly, right? I'm very much in favor of kind of agency for those countries, meaning that it's not just up to the international community to help them develop, to help them solve protracted conflicts, to resolve Nagorno Karabakh. I totally agree. On the other hand, I think in terms of actually achieving some progress, it's a multilateral issue. So here I slightly disagree with this position on independence. I think the existing formats, for example, within the OSCE, are in the long run more promising than just an independent approach. Even though those formats seem to be protracted, like there's this Geneva format on Abkhazia and South Ossetia and the Georgian conflicts, there's the Minsk group on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, nothing seems to be moving. But after all, I think it has to be a joint effort. So I wonder what also the audience thinks, but in some way I have the feeling that involving at least us, the European partners, the EU partners, would be important. We know that those countries are members of the Eastern Partnership Program, so somehow we are already partners, but frankly it's not a lot of resources which is flowing to this program. And from what I've heard from my own interviews in Georgia, in the case of protracted conflicts, it seems that international actors have completely withdrawn. It may be the Ukraine effect, that international donors prefer to engage there because it's a hotter conflict indeed. Maybe it's a reputational issue. Everybody understands that things are unlikely to move forward quickly. Anyway, there seems to be quite a negligence from the side of the European partners, and maybe there is some additional effort we could do. I don't have a concrete recipe, but that's just an additional take on the responsibility of handling the conflicts.
Thank you very much. Leila, do you want to respond immediately? Or I have some questions also to you. So.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe you will ask the question.
Well,
then I will.
Concerning Armenia, I have perhaps three questions, then one on Georgia. First of all, you mentioned the diaspora. Now, as far as I know, there are two big diasporas, one in the US, one in Russia. There's, of course, one also in Europe, who was always lobbying me in the European Parliament. What does the diaspora in Russia say now to the development? Is it quiet? Is it instrumentalized? Could it be instrumentalized by Moscow to have some different influence? Or is the diaspora in the West, especially in the US, just stronger and supporting the development? The second question would be on Turkey. Has the new government said anything about improving relationship with Turkey? Because it's a very delicate issue, of course, more for Armenia than for Turkey. And the third question, you mentioned about this strategy of independence. The question is, you need two to dance a tango. You need two to solve the issue in Nagorno Karabakh. But for Azerbaijan, not having that same development, do they have an interest really in trying to go forward with the solution? Because when you mentioned that the internal factors and the external factors have some relationship, Then for Azerbaijan it would be to stay in the system as they are. They could maybe endanger the system if they would go for a compromise of Nagorno-Karabakh, or do you see it differently? So these would be the three questions to you, and maybe afterwards on Georgia. None of you mentioned the internal situation. I've been in all three countries, but especially also in Georgia, followed with many meetings with Mr. Saakashvili, who was reforming the country but became more and more authoritarian. Of course, now those who are no longer in the government say the system brought by Ivanishvili, who is the figurehead behind, still is not very democratic. What is your impression? Is it a democratic country? Is it democratic development? Did the election of Salome Sorovishvili prove that democracy is embedded, or how do you see the situation? Maybe, LEILA.
Yeah. So I will start with the diaspora issue. Diaspora is, of course, one of the key issues for developments in Armenia, because if you ask who are the external actors in general in political situation in Armenia, I would name two: Russia and diaspora, Western diaspora in this regard, because Russia plus Russian diaspora, they're more or less the same. Armenian diaspora in Russia is also different, but the key of the public opinion makers and people close to the establishment, they're quite active, and in a sense, there is this Lazarev Club which came up with the statement after revolution, stating that Russia is always sort of for Armenia. Armenia is basically warning the revolution makers from moving too close to the West. So there was quite a sharp reaction of the Armenian diaspora. Yet, as I said, there is a competition between not the soft power as an instrumental component of the policy, but rather a links in a form of the attractiveness of the model. And this young generation, particularly the IT sector was one of the major driving force and in this revolution. They were relatively free from the influence of the corrupt, oligarchy groups. And there are a few projects which were coming in a mass scale from the Western diaspora, such as quite an important event was a big concert of the Armenian band called Down something, forgot the name, Down the System, exactly, System of the Down, in 2015, and it was bringing this enormous influence and messages of liberal values together with theirs. So they are we're bringing this influence from the West. Also projects of Aurora Prize, for instance, and other many very influential and powerful civil society projects coming from the Western diaspora. In this sense, I would say that the Western diaspora took over, and as the Russian diaspora basically is a reflection of the Russian interests and state interests, and Russia already, official Russia, discredited itself on many accounts. The dissatisfaction with Russia has been accumulating in Armenia for a few years already. There were electrical protests. There were major protests related to the murder of the Armenian family by the Russian military, and there was a very great unhappiness and awareness that Russia is an unreliable security partner. In 2016, when Russia didn't intervene to stop Azerbaijan during the violation of the ceasefire. So the other question about Armenia. Well, to tell you the Turkey, it's a very interesting issue because Pashinyan belongs to the group in the 90s of Levon Petrosyan. He, of course, they split. But I know I met with him in the 90s, with Paul. And he was sharing the views that the certain issues of the past should not, that was Levon Petrosyan's group, political party view, that the past issues should not be on the way of regulating relations with Turkey. I think in general Nikol Pashinyan is perceived both by Azerbaijan and Turkey as more liberal political group or representatives of the more liberal circles than the others who represented the Karabakh clan, the military groups, veterans, Karabakh war veterans. So I think in general, one of the reasons why Azerbaijan, for instance, didn't utilize this domestic instability or uncertainty in Armenia to take an advantage and move in to get back occupied territories is also the reason that they perceive Nikol Pashinyan as someone with more liberal ideas, in spite of the fact that he came on quite a strong nationalistic rhetoric. He came and he committed, but majority in Azerbaijan, for instance, they think that he has to. It's not what he really thinks, but he has to, because he has to accommodate too many radical forces and too important players, at least at this period of consolidation of power. Regarding what Azerbaijan, the leadership is interested in, there is no question that Azerbaijan probably is the most interested in liberation of the occupied territories, in spite of all these, benefits which it might get out of the status quo and things like that. I mean, there are enormous amount of the people from the occupied territories. They assess from 600,000 to 800,000 people. Their rights were not restored. They're all scattered in the country, and they quite often create problems for the government. They come up to demonstrate, particularly recently, they come up to picketing the government and the presidential apparatus, demanding their rights and things like that. So it's not a simple issue to deal with as the consolidation. I mean, the legitimacy of the government is not so much, while nationalism, of course, feeds and helps legitimize the political status quo in both countries. In Azerbaijan, it's less of a factor as compared to the oil resources and energy factor, which helps Azerbaijani government to promote its status. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
Alexandra.
you. Thank you. It's a tricky question about how democratic Georgia is, but I'll try to give you a glimpse of at least what I experienced. Well, first of all, I would like to mention corruption, or actually Georgia's extremely successful fight against low-level corruption. I'm not saying Georgia doesn't have corruption, because many, locals, insiders say there is lots of corruption in upper tiers of the government or economy. But if you think of corruption that you as a citizen might be very likely to encounter in, many countries of the world, and Georgia was one of them, this is really gone. So like police officers or traffic police extracting money just because your car looks nice or whatever, this is really history. So in this sense, I would say, and this is already a development which happened under Saakashvili, this is a very big step towards what I would consider a democratic and open society. But there are also some less optimistic stories, I should say, and here I would like to speak about one big issue, I suppose, which is gay rights. And it's not so much about gays per se, but it's about gay rights as part of human rights. And here I experienced an extreme example of huge intolerance and doing nothing by government, basically. So, as you might know, in Georgia there are some people who are really against gays as such and gay rights, and the church unfortunately also supports a lot this kind of ultra-conservative movement. So there are some progressive forces, let me put it this way, some young people who want to have gay prides in Tbilisi sometime in summer, just as in many other European capitals. And by the way, gay rights is also, of course, part of the association agreement and everything that Georgia is supposed to comply to as being a European partner and part of the European Eastern Partnership Program. Anyway, I happened to be there in Georgia last year on the day of this supposed gay pride, which was, of course, not a gay pride, but just a little demonstration by a few people who dared. Anyway, I went there expecting them to be on the designated place and just going there and seeing what happens. But in fact, I saw many more things than just that, because the whole city was full of police, riot police, and at first I didn't understand what's actually exactly going on and who is protecting whom against whom. Then I spoke to a few people. Thankfully, some people are ready to speak Russian. Anyway, the riot police was actually kind of circling around or trying to stabilize the little square where the gay demonstration was happening. And there were many people, most of them dressed in black, many of them men, who were actively protesting against the gay demonstration, which was many blocks away because there were several police, how do you call this, like when they stand one next to each other, like in full riot gear. So they let me pass, probably because I looked unthreatening or European or whatever. So I passed several of those huge police cordons and then ended up on this little square where there were about 100 people, I suppose, maybe 200, absolutely colorfully dressed and cheerful people, but not that cheerful because the overall atmosphere is menacing, in fact. But what's the most interesting thing is when I left, this is where I saw this church-supported crowd. I mean, nothing against the church, but when I exited this last police cordon, there were those black guys dressed in black and priests with them looking at me as if I was a national traitor or some really bad person. So I'm telling you this personal story, which I suppose is representative for what's going on there every year when they try to do this gay parade, just to show you that certain things that we would take for granted in EU or EU's part of Europe are not yet taken for granted in the region. And I suppose Georgia is one of the most critical cases. We know Russia, Ukraine are not among the most, Serbia, not the most gay-friendly places, but Georgia seems to me to stand out. And the thing is that the government does not seem to do enough to change the situation. And it's of course hard to change traditional conservative way of thinking. So that's just a little glimpse. And maybe some of you caught notice of the so-called white noise demonstrations. This was a completely different story, rather related to police violence. And here I don't know exactly what happened, but it was about clubbing. Apparently there's a very vibrant clubbing scene in Tbilisi, and some people were taking drugs, allegedly, and then the police stormed the club and dragged out the people who were, not all of them were perhaps drug takers. Anyway, independently of what happened there, very big protests erupted. It was before the presidential elections. I actually didn't follow that closely, so I don't know exactly how it ended up. But in terms of activity of the population, I thought, wow, people take some police violence situations seriously. And no matter if drugs are good or bad, there may be other laws in Georgia than in, say, Netherlands. But people felt that they want to be heard and protest a government crackdown, basically. Generally, I experienced the Georgian, like young people or people whom you see on the street, as very pro-European and very, Western, open-minded. But I think, keeping in mind those stories that I told you, we shouldn't confuse this pro-Europeanness with necessarily that standard of democracy that we take for granted in our countries.
But,
thank you. Please.
Yeah, I could probably add that there is one serious matter of concern in Georgia, and it's the economic situation in terms of oligarchic structure. So here is, of course, the question whether you consider greater prospects for democracy in the country with one oligarch or with many. So, like in Ukraine, for instance, and these elections actually showed that the oligarchic structure which exists in Georgia is quite strong. And so far there is no check on power because, as you know, the administrative resources were used quite extensively by the incumbent. There was a mass forgiveness of the credit debts right before the elections, during the election time. And so people basically perceive it that just another extension of the same power structure with the major actor, oligarch, behind it. So there won't be any significant change in the policies. So these elections basically did not change significantly anything, partly because there is just one structure. And there is persecution, not persecution, at least there was a criminal case opened against the other quite prominent businessman, Hazaradze and DBC Group, a few months ago. So that basically proves that there is an attempt of monopolizing and not allowing enough freedom, economic freedom in Georgia. So this is the matter of concern in terms of checks and balances in the societies, in the country.
Okay. If you want to add something, you can do it afterwards. Now we take some questions. Yeah, Hans Gärtner, Botschafter Raunig. Yeah.
Thank you. You talked a lot about this one elephant in the room, which is Russia, but we have at least two more elephants, of course. One elephant is China, so how much do these countries want to participate in this Belt and Road initiative? And what is the balance between Russia and China in that regard? But also the US is the third elephant, and we know that since Saakashvili, the Georgian-American relations are very close. However, more importantly now, how would Armenia and Azerbaijan position themselves during this, what Hannes mentioned, the escalation between the US and Iran. So Armenia and Azerbaijan have very close trade relations with Iran. Would they participate in the sanctions regime? So what would they do?
Yes, thank you. Punch of Taranik.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. I would have many questions, but I have to reduce them. First of all, what I did not hear in your presentations is what role do you see is the OSCE playing in conflict solution in the Caucasus, in South Caucasus? Secondly, there were very interesting parts in the speech of the Azeri foreign minister in Milano at the OSCE Ministerial Council. There he more or less announced that 2019 will be a very interesting year regarding solving the Nagorny Karabakh conflict. Whether you have, what's your assessment on that, or is there something behind this speech which was somehow remarkable if one follows these speeches throughout the years? That was a different one. And thirdly, what I always was asking myself, Pashinyan, he had the power on the streets, but in parliament he did not have the goal. And how did that come out of the architecture of power that it changed that quickly that he got then the support of the parliamentarians from the other side? Thank you.
Another question on this?
Yes, I want.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much. It was a most interesting evening. But my question you partly took already. I wanted to know what is the influence of Iran in this whole conflict, and also in connection, and how does Russia react to that?
Thank you. So we have the question of China and the Belt of Road initiative, then the question of US-Iran conflict, sort of the Russia, could this develop? We have the question by the Ambassador Ranik about the OSCE role and the special speech made by the Azeri foreign minister. I think these are the basic issues we have to deal. Please, who wants to start? Yeah.
Well, maybe I could make a break because I just
Okay.
answered, so I
Please. Okay,
get
I can
some
start.
water.
Yeah, the easiest, I think, is the Pashinyan and mobilization of parliamentary
Yeah.
support question. I mean, in France, we witnessed that with Macron. He appeared out of nowhere and, lifted a totally new party or movement into power. We see how he struggles now, but
and lost a lot of it with again.
Yeah, but I don't want to be pessimistic, but something like that it's not unlikely that it happens to Pashinyan, and as I was referring previously, there needs to be some balance with a viable opposition and some societal control. Some people are also simply pragmatic. I think they want to stick to power and just switch sides. And by the way, this regards maybe Pashinyan himself, because I remember LEILA was posing a rhetorical question, like, why didn't Russia intervene? Perhaps they underestimated Pashinyan. I think Russia has a strong leverage on Armenia, which goes beyond personalities. Because if we remember that Pashinyan started off in the parliament with his little party, which was very much focused on exiting the Eurasian Economic Union. What happens when he gains power? There was a kind of summit of this Eurasian Economic Union just this December, I think, in Moscow. Of course, he's on board. Nobody in Armenia talks about exiting the Eurasian Economic Union anymore. I just cite this as a little example of some predictable pragmatism in politics, I suppose. yeah, I wonder if there will be a chance for Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Maybe the foreign minister of Azerbaijan was putting some hope into new leaders of Armenia. I don't know much of what's going behind the scenes, but I do hope that there will be some breakthrough simply because their new personality is now in power. The OSCE, well, I wanted to say by pointing out the strength of multilateral approaches that the OSCE would be a suitable venue, I suppose. Even though we don't see progress now, neither in the Minsk group nor in the Geneva group, there are other formats where the OSCE is involved. I suppose that's the only venue where progress can be achieved. Probably there are some bilateral initiatives necessary in order to, strengthen this process, but the multilateral one where all stakeholders are involved, or at least the most important elephants in the room. I mean, Russia is involved in the OSCE, and talking there is probably still the most viable way, but you know much more about the OSCE than I do, so I wonder how realistic it is, and I understand a certain frustration also from the people that things don't get moving. At the same time, just maybe to mention, connected to that, what I forgot to mention before, Nagorno-Karabakh is certainly a most dangerous conflict in the region, but if we look at the Georgian ones, and this is also where a lot of frustration was built up, also towards the OSCE, that nothing seems to be moving. The Georgian conflicts are actually not that bad, if we put it in perspective. The Ukrainian case with Donbass, with an outright war going on, is the worst case scenario, which Georgia certainly managed to avert. But then there's a Moldovan example with Transnistria, which some respondents to whom I spoke in Georgia were referring to as something it would be a dream scenario for them, where this kind of normalization of trade and interpersonal relations went much, much further. So I think Georgia still has a way to go to maybe pursue this normalization even further, like Moldova and Transnistria do, but Nagorno-Karabakh may remain tricky. So here I think LEILA just knows much more about it.
So the first question was about Iran and US. That's a very interesting issue because Iran in this conflict, as you know, appeared to be closer to Armenia than to Azerbaijan because of many reasons. One of which Iran has little interest in having a strong Azerbaijan, independent Azerbaijan on its borders, while having 20 million of Azeri citizens meaning citizens of Azerbaijani origin. So Iran has never been perceived as a sincere broker in this conflict, and there is this ambiguous relationship between Azerbaijan and Iran due to the suspicions to each other, and also because of the in one country secular regime, in the other religious. Also, Azerbaijan is quite a close ally of Israel. And however, Azerbaijan is trying to support a certain level of normal and civilized relationship with Iran. Sometimes you see they meet at the level of the even military heads. So there are attempts to get involved in some active diplomacy, but in substance, Iranian-Azerbaijani relationship, they are determined to be quite distant. US is in a mess, right? But sanctions help. Sanctions help. They help because the perception of Russia as a weaker power center makes
make countries more proactive in terms of their policies regarding their relations with the West. So they are, as small countries' leaders, particularly those who are autocrats, they are quite conformists. So they as you called it, pragmatic. Yeah, I would call it more opportunistic, but they do follow the change of the power centers. So perception of Russia as being a weak actor exactly because of the sanctions, and that makes them make their own conclusions. I would say that OSCE, unfortunate situation, grew the OSCE process in the sense that either OSCE process should be changed because it fulfilled its role already in the 90s. The role of OSCE was to contain the clashing interests of the bigger powers who are, promoting their interests in an uncivilized way, let's say. So put them together and to contain the possible violence and military stage of the conflict, but it doesn't go further. And there is some structural problem with the process. And it's a separate and serious issue. Because one of the reasons why there is an arms race in the region is because of the failure, some structural failure of the OSCE process. Because there is normative uncertainty, because two exclusionary principles are negotiated at the table, because there is a bargaining, because the occupied territories or military power is legitimized there in this process as a bargaining tool. It forces the countries to conduct some actions trying to boost their status, military status, in this process. So I think it should be seriously reconsidered, the process of OSCE, because I remember a very angry reaction of one Georgian representative at quite high-level conference when somebody from OSCE offered the Georgians also to get their conflicts in the similar format as OSCE. This was absolutely angry and very negative reaction from the Georgian side. So that's the perception of the process. I don't know what the foreign minister, there's very little transparency in what the government is doing in terms of their approach to the conflict. Maybe they just wanted to say that, they have hopes because of the changes in Armenia, and they just wanted to announce their expectations that a change of Karabakh war veterans by this new, more liberal thinking political generation might be bringing some changes. I don't know, it sounds very abstract to me because they usually don't share the more specific plans. How come the parliament? I'll tell you something. I was in Yerevan in 1998, yeah? And I already heard from Yerevanis how much. So it was almost 20 years ago. They were saying that they can't stand the domination of the Karabakh clan, and they're fed up. And that was 20 years ago. So you can imagine how unpopular was the Republican Party, and probably facing this mass mobilization and opposition to the current status quo. I think it was relatively easy, and because the legitimacy of these groups were also related to Russia, apparently getting Russian reaction. And you know that these divisions in Armenia, the clashes, they're quite dramatic. In none of these our countries, the change of powers and other critical moments were accompanying for so many casualties. So the events in Armenia might end up with in quite a lot of blood. And I think this was also one of the considerations why this happened. I don't know.
Thank you. Are there still some questions? Yes, the lady there and the lady there. No, it's the same.
Thank you. Let me introduce myself. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission at Georgian Embassy here in Austria. And, well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organisers of the event. There is so much going on all over the world, and it is really not easy to keep our issues floating, and thanks for doing this this evening. And also my thanks goes to the distinguished speakers for sharing their views on our region. As I have some questions as well, but I'd like to make a brief remark on some of the issues. Obviously, I have many things to say, but I'll share a few. As for the conflict, I would rather not point that as a frozen one, because although there is no shooting, there is no peace on the ground. And it is evolving step by step. And with the integration treaties that Russia signed with the occupation regimes, it very much absorbs Georgia's occupied regions into its military, political, cultural, into all the spheres. So it is the obvious. Although you've also noted that Georgia is doing its job by offering all the possibilities that were given us by the association agreement and the DCFTA, including the visa-free travel to its citizens that are living in the occupied territories. We are continuing to do this, and we are also offering some confidence-building projects in order to restore connections with those people living on the other side. And as you also mentioned, we are doing our job in terms of pragmatic approach to Russia, and we have established the government that came into power in 2012. It has established a new informal format of talks that is basically concerns the humanitarian issues like transportation links or economic ties that were disrupted. They have restored indeed, but unfortunately this restoration, step-by-step restoration, did not translate into political solution of the conflict we are having with the Russian Federation. And in terms of political and in terms of resolution, the process is very much stalled. In the Geneva, which is the only format between Russia and Georgia, well, with the presence of the regimes from Zahumi and Khimari, and with the EU and OSCE and the UN co-chairing the talks. It's been 10 years already that the talks are ongoing, but there is no progress on the core issues of the discussions. So what I wanted to hear, and we in terms of Nagorny Karabakh conflict, but what I was missing from the discussions here how you see the resolution of the conflict and what will be the influence, how Russia should be influenced in order to reverse the situation we are having on the ground with regards to border particularly, because we've heard some thoughts about Nagorny Karabakh, so I would like you to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question.
Thank you. My question would be related to the independency you talked before, and it's about Armenia, which is not independent at all because of the Eurasian Economic Union, where it's more the periphery and related to the center Russia. But also, if you look at Georgia, which maybe would be part of the European Union, and there also would be the periphery to the center Brussels, for example. So even if we come to independency, the question is how to address it, especially because of the oligarchical system you mentioned before. You are also backed, the oligarchs are backed by the Western world as well as the Russian world. So how to address and get independent if this is even a solution?
So, very easy questions. How to solve the Georgian issues, and how to influence Russia, and then, of course, this question: what is independence in a world of today with some centers of powers and oligarchs still trying to establish their and save their power?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Maybe I just start. I don't have all the answers. Absolutely not. Thank you for the comment, distinguished representative of the embassy, Georgia. I have the feeling that Russia generally has now fewer resources to interfere in the region and also to carry the burden or the costs associated with supporting some of the, well, I shouldn't probably say separatism. Anyway, you know what I mean, like supporting the regimes in South Ossetia and Abkhazia and, pursuing its interests there, let me put it this way. And this can be a chance, actually. And if we look at Armenia, with Russia not objecting to the signing of CEPA, the agreement with the EU, which of course comes short of an association agreement, but still is an important step. So maybe there's a sign of Russia slightly shifting their priorities, putting lots of resources into what's going on in Ukraine and Crimea now. Maybe this is a chance for the Caucasus. But this would require, as I said before, us as Western partners and the OSCE to somehow fill the gap. I have another idea where the OSCE can be active. It's trade promotion. It's the second dimension. It's connectivity. So what the Georgians try in terms of normalization of trade and in general engagement of their breakaway territories, this is something where the OSCE could be involved, I think. It's harder on the actual political solution of the conflicts concerned. So I imagine that by political resolution, the Georgian representative meant the incorporation back into Georgia. I'm afraid we need to be more patient on that. But maybe steps towards it, which are being pragmatically taken, maybe they lead us there. Simply because in the end, Russia will be put in front of facts. You know, those republics being physically or de facto strongly integrated with the motherland, maybe it is a necessary prerequisite for Russia withdrawing, by the way, in a face-saving manner. I've been observing Russia for a long time, also lived in this country for a long time, and I think this is, in terms of international relations, one of the most important things for Russia, a face-saving option. And maybe we haven't gone to extreme lengths at offering Russia such an option. So this is one important thing when we think of how to influence Russia. And another one, it's Russia's transactional approach to foreign policy. When I speak to Russian representatives, often they would say, and what do we gain from it? So it's maybe not the kind of bargaining we feel very comfortable with, but after all, it's a job of diplomats. And I believe that in addition to a face-saving option for Russia, there needs to be a certain gain from negotiations. So maybe in the future there will be some ideas, some informal ideas. Not all of this will reach the public, I suppose, but what to offer Russia in return. It sounds very Machiavellistic, but I suppose keeping those things in mind, we can have maybe a more promising approach towards this very uncomfortable neighbor, which will not go away anywhere. So that's the reality which I think most, all of the Caucasian countries realize, that they just need to handle it. And in this sense, the issue of independence, there won't be any independence. I mean, there are always core countries and periphery countries, and you could argue that Bulgaria and Romania within the EU are less independent than, say, Germany and France. I think if we just flip the coin and recognize that interdependence is a joint asset, maybe this is something that will get us further in the discussion and also in reappreciation of multilateralism. And again, organizations like the EU, like the OSCE. So this is my optimistic hope for the future.
Okay. LEILA?
Yeah, actually, I really concerned about Russia's policy in Georgian conflict because they're moving the border which they occupied, and it was voiced on many occasions that Russia is moving deeper with the border. And I think it's exactly because it doesn't experience any costs of such a small and sort of invisible actions. So there are various ways of Russia to cause a bit trouble, even on the territories where they are were stopped, but they're not. So I think there should be a combination. First of all, one should answer the question, why Russia is using conflicts in these status games? Why it's conflicts? Obviously because Russia is weak. Russia cannot offer the better economic or political model, so the only way it can use, keep the countries under control is through conflicts. Who benefits from these conflicts? The elite of Russia. They already came to the point of no return, in a sense, because if they start to revise this approach, the power game based on the external collector of lands, which Putin has the reputation of, so that will be very difficult. So that's why I'm saying that I had a publication in the 90s, actually, about that one of the reasons of this conflict is the loss of sense of interdependency in the region, due to the colonial experience when all the economic relations were in the region, in the Caucasus, were mediated by Moscow. Armenia was not aware how much they are dependent on Azerbaijan, or Georgia was not aware. So these three countries lost this sense of interdependency, but to which you can come only to going through the stage of being aware of your independency as a subject of international relations. When you can realize that violation of internationally recognized borders of your neighbor will have a consequence. And the consequence is that now Armenia is deprived of the major communications with their very rich neighbors and pragmatic neighbors, Azerbaijan and Turkey, because of this lack of sense of interdependency the Upper Lars road was not operational for the last 2 weeks. And by the way, there is an awareness by Pashinyan that the deadlocked condition of Armenia actually forces it to find the way of good relations with its neighbors. And that's what I meant by bringing the awareness of independent subject of international relations. Not relying on diaspora advocacy or Moscow or Washington or Brussels, who will put pressure on your neighbor, and then they will share their energy resources in spite of the fact that 20% of the territories are under occupation, but rather try to regulate and normalize the relationship with the vis-a-vis neighbors. And Pashinyan already said that we're landlocked, and these two ways through Lars, through Georgia, and to Iran, these roads might be closed any time. So there is an awareness that, unless the countries start to find a way out of the situation by regulating their relationship with their neighbors, none of them, neither Azerbaijan nor Turkey, had, by the time of independence, any territorial claims to Armenia or something like that. So there is a way to develop normal relationship, and maybe I suspect that foreign minister of Azerbaijan might have had that idea. I can't be responsible for what he's saying.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, of course, we could start the next discussion on these principal issues. I think it was very, very good to have that discussion. Just to mention that maybe that Western or EU soft power can have an effect. Of course, it needs a long time. It's not a short-term effect, as we see in Armenia. And of course, it's not the biggest issue, but anyway, I think we see also with Georgia, these effects of EU can be positive, but of course, on the other hand, the countries have to do their job themselves. So we have the positive effect in Armenia, in Georgia, but also in Moldova, in connecting with Transnistria. So if we are not having too high aims, but have more moderate aims, and the countries concerned are trying to do their own job, as you said, this kind of independence and interdependence, I think it is a connection between independence and interdependence in the region. I think that would be very good. A subject I think we should deal very much in the future is about also the oligarchic structures in many of the countries, including also what I recently, was informed about the complexity of the warlords, for example, also in war areas like in Syria. We always see the military and the political side, but the economic side and the corruption and these kind of economic structures have such a strong influence on conflict solution or non-solution, that maybe this is also a subject we should further discuss in our institute here. Now we have water already standing there, but it will be joined by wine, not Georgian wine, but Austrian wine, and something to eat. So please stay here and enjoy the evening, and perhaps put one of the other questions to our speakers. But I think I want to thank you again for coming, and hope to see you again in some of our future events. And thank you, of course, to the speakers.